It was just after midnight in North Epping, the kind of quiet Sydney suburb where nothing ever seemed out of place. Tree-lined streets, dark houses, no noise, everyone asleep. Inside one of those homes, something unthinkable happened. By morning, 5 members of the same family were dead. A father, a mother, 2 young boys, and an aunt who had been staying the night. There were no signs of forced entry. No emergency calls, no neighbours who heard screams. What investigators found instead was a level of violence so severe it stunned even the most experienced officers. The year was 2009, and within hours the story spread across Australia. A peaceful family home had become the scene of one of the most brutal crimes the country had seen in decades. So what really happened inside that house that night? Subscribe to the channel, take a breath, and let's begin. Saturday, the 18th of July, 2009 began like any other winter weekend in North Epping. The Lin family spent the evening at home. There were no reports of arguments, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. Min Lin was 45, known as a hard-working and successful businessman. His wife, Lily, 43, was deeply involved in caring for the family. Their sons, Henry and Terry, were just 12 and 9 years old, still at the age where weekends meant schoolwork, games, and family routines. That night, Lily's sister, Irene Lee, aged 39, was also staying over. One family member was missing. Brenda Lynn, the eldest child, was 15 years old and overseas on a school trip. It was the only reason she wasn't in the house that night. Her bedroom remained untouched, a detail that would later become impossible to ignore. Sometime after midnight, the routine of the house ended. Investigators would later determine that the attacks happened in the early hours of the morning while the family slept in their respective bedrooms. There was no evidence that anyone tried to run, no signs that anyone managed to warn the others. The family didn't answer calls the next morning. Concern grew. Eventually, police were asked to check the house. What they found inside stopped them cold. All 5 family members were dead. Each had been attacked in their bedroom. The level of violence was extreme, unlike anything usually seen in suburban family homes. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were locked. Valuables were left behind. The timeline was clear. The silence was deliberate. By the end of that day, the Lin Family Murders had become national news. Fear spread quickly, not just through North Epping, but across Sydney. If this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. And as investigators began piecing together the final hours of that night, one thing became disturbingly clear. Whoever did this didn't rush. They took their time, and the house itself was about to tell that story. When officers entered the Lin family home on the morning of the 18th of July 2009, it didn't feel like a break-in. It felt like someone had been there for a while. The first thing noticed was the power. The house was dark, not because of a fault, but because the electricity had been deliberately switched off at the circuit breaker. That single action suggested forethought. Someone had taken the time to reduce visibility, knowing exactly where to go. As detectives moved through the house, the pattern became clear. Each family member had been attacked in their own bedroom. There was no sign that anyone had tried to flee down a hallway or barricade a door. Beds were the focal point. Whatever happened while the victims were vulnerable and likely asleep. One room stood out for a different reason. Brenda Lynn's bedroom was untouched. Her bed was neatly made. No blood. No disturbance. It silently confirmed what police already knew. The killer knew exactly who was supposed to be in that house and who wasn't. Forensic teams documented 24 distinct bloody shoe impressions throughout the home. The prints moved between rooms and back again, showing a clear path rather than chaotic movement. There were no overlapping patterns, no evidence of a struggle spilling into shared spaces. It looked like one person moving with purpose. Nothing had been ransacked. Wallets were still inside. Jewelry remained where it was kept. Expensive items were left behind. This wasn't about money, and it wasn't about opportunity. Another detail raised eyebrows. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. Doors and windows were intact. Locks hadn't been damaged. Whoever entered that house didn't need to break in. By the time forensic work wrapped up, investigators were left with an unsettling conclusion. This wasn't a rushed or impulsive act. It was contained, targeted, and deliberate. The house itself had become a silent witness, and everything inside it pointed to someone who felt comfortable being there. Which raised the most dangerous question of all. Who would walk into a family home in North Epping and leave it like this? By the afternoon of the 18th of July, 2009, the case had already become one of the largest homicide investigations in New South Wales history. More than 100 police officers were assigned in the early stages, with forensic teams working through the Lin family home for days. The street was sealed off, media crews gathered. What had happened inside that house was now national news. Investigators moved quickly to map the family's final 48 hours. They confirmed that Min and Lily Lin had spent the previous evening at home. Phone records showed no distress calls. There were no unusual financial transactions, no signs of recent conflict, and no evidence the family believed they were in danger. The timeline was clean, almost too clean. Early theories began to fall apart one by one. A robbery motive didn't hold. Nothing of value was missing. Even small, easily carried items were untouched. A random attack also made little sense. The offender had gone directly to each bedroom without hesitation. There was no wandering, no trial and error. Detectives then looked closely at access. The Lin home showed no forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. That detail pushed the investigation in a new direction. Attention shifted toward people who already had a reason to be inside the house, or at least knew it well. Friends, relatives, business associates. Forensic analysis continued to build pressure. The shoe prints found inside were consistent in size and pattern, pointing away from multiple attackers. The deliberate shutdown of the power supply suggested someone who understood the house well enough to move through it in the dark. As the days passed, police began quietly re-interviewing people connected to the family. Some were questioned more than once. Alibis were checked, then checked again. Small inconsistencies started to matter. Behind the scenes, investigators were no longer asking what happened. They were asking who had the opportunity, the familiarity, and the nerve to walk calmly through that house and leave it the way it was. And before long, one name began to surface more often than the other. As detectives narrowed their focus to people with access to the Lin family home, one name kept resurfacing: Robert Z. Z wasn't a stranger. He lived less than 3 kilometers from the Lin residence in North Epping. He was the brother-in-law of Min Lin and had been closely involved with the family for years. Close enough, in fact, to have a key to their house. On the surface, Z didn't fit the image many expected. He had once worked as a medical doctor before leaving the profession. At the time of the murders, he was unemployed and under financial strain. His marriage was unstable. Those details alone didn't make him a suspect, but they made investigators look closer. Police began reconstructing Zoy's movements around the 18th of July 2009. Surveillance footage placed his car on nearby roads during the early hours of the morning. His phone activity raised questions, and when officers searched his property, they found something they couldn't ignore: traces of blood in his garage that later tested as a match to members of the Lin family. There were other details too. Z had disposed of shoes shortly after the murders. Shoe boxes were destroyed. Given the 24 shoe impressions found inside the Lin home, that detail mattered more than it might have in any other case. Still, the case wasn't simple. Z denied any involvement. His wife initially supported his alibi, claiming he had been home in bed at the time. There was no murder weapon found, no confession, and the idea that a man could kill 5 relatives without being seen or heard felt almost impossible to many. But investigators kept coming back to the same points: access, proximity, familiarity. Z knew the house. He knew the family's routines. He knew Brenda was overseas, and he had the ability to move in and out of the area without attracting attention. By the time police formally charged him, the case had shifted dramatically. This was no longer about an unknown intruder. It was about whether the danger had been sitting at the family table all along, and proving that in court would be far harder than naming a suspect. When Robert Sy was charged with 5 counts of murder in 2011, many believed the case was heading toward a swift conclusion. Instead, it entered a legal maze that would stretch across 5 years, test multiple juries, and leave the outcome hanging in the balance. The first trial began in 2013 at the Supreme Court of New South Wales. It ended without a verdict. The jury couldn't agree. Some believed the evidence pointed clearly to Z. Others weren't convinced it crossed the line beyond doubt. The second trial followed in 2014. Once again, no verdict. Another hung jury. By the third trial, frustration was building. The prosecution laid out the same core evidence: the blood found in Jai's garage, matching Lin family members, the disposal of shoes, the surveillance footage, the access to the house, and the timing of his movements. Still, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. 3 trials, no conviction, no acquittal. Public opinion began to split. Some questioned how a case with so much circumstantial evidence could stall repeatedly. Others argued the lack of direct proof meant the wrong man might be on trial. Then came the fourth trial in 2016. This time, something changed. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict. 11-1, Robert C. was found guilty of murdering all 5 members of the Lin family. It wasn't unanimous, but under New South Wales law, it was enough. In February 2017, Z was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge stating that the crimes were heinous and carried out with deliberate intent. He would never be eligible for parole. Even then, the case didn't fully end. Z maintained his innocence and later appealed the conviction. In 2021, the appeal was dismissed, cementing the sentence but not silencing the debate, because while the courts had reached a conclusion, questions still lingered in the public mind, and at the centre of those questions was one unsettling issue. Why would someone do this at all? During the trials, prosecutors argued that the murders weren't driven by sudden rage or desperation, but by something far darker and long-standing. At the centre of that argument was Robert C. and his relationship with the Lin family, particularly Min Lin. By 2009, the contrast between the two men was stark. Min Lin was financially successful, running a thriving business and supporting his extended family. C, on the other hand, had left medicine years earlier, was unemployed and struggling financially. According to court arguments, that imbalance had created resentment that built quietly over time. But money wasn't the only issue raised. Prosecutors also presented evidence suggesting Z had developed an inappropriate fixation on Min Lin's wife, Lily. During the trial, the court heard that this alleged obsession had deepened feelings of rejection and humiliation. The Crown argued that this combination, envy, desire, and wounded pride, created a dangerous emotional pressure that eventually exploded. The defense pushed back hard. They argued the motive theory relied too heavily on interpretation rather than proof. They pointed out that financial stress and personal frustration, while real, did not automatically lead to violence. They also challenged the idea that obsession alone could explain such an extreme act, especially without eyewitnesses or a confession. They argued the crime showed planning, restraint, and familiarity, not a spontaneous loss of control. The deliberate shutdown of the power, the methodical movement through the house, and the decision to leave Brenda unharmed because she was known to be overseas all pointed to forethought. This wasn't framed as a moment of madness. It was framed as something that had been forming quietly, fed by comparison, entitlement, and rejection, until one night it crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Yet even with a motive presented, many found it difficult to fully grasp, because understanding why someone kills is never as simple as listing reasons. And for the only person left behind, the motive mattered far less than the loss that followed. When the trials ended and the courtroom emptied, only one person remained at the centre of the wreckage: Brenda Lin. She was 15 years old when her parents, her 2 younger brothers, and her aunt were killed. At the time, she was overseas on a school trip. She didn't hear the news from police. She learned what had happened through messages and online posts, while still thousands of kilometres away. By the time she returned to Australia, her entire immediate family was gone. In the years that followed, Brenda stayed largely out of the public eye. When she did speak, her words were measured and restrained. There were no dramatic statements, just grief, disbelief, and the weight of a loss that never really eases. During sentencing in February 2017, her victim impact statement described a life split cleanly into 2 parts, before and after the 18th of July 2009. She spoke about growing up without parents, about milestones missed, about the silence left behind by her brother's absence. The court heard that the murders didn't just end 5 lives. They reshaped one forever. The legal process dragged on, even after the life sentence was handed down. Robert Sy appealed his conviction, maintaining his innocence. For Brenda, it meant the case never truly rested. Each appeal reopened wounds, dragged memories back into the light. In 2021, the appeal was dismissed. The conviction stood. The sentence remained life without parole. For the justice system, that was the end. For Brenda, it wasn't easy. She carried the knowledge that the person responsible had once been part of her family's inner circle. Someone trusted, someone familiar. That reality haunted the case as much as the violence itself. The Lin family home was eventually sold. The street returned to normal. New families moved in. But some crimes don't fade with time. And as this case settled into Australia's criminal history, it joined a darker pattern, one that raised an unsettling truth about violence behind closed doors. Because the Lin family murders were not the only time a household in Australia was wiped out overnight. The Lin family murders didn't exist in isolation. As shocking as they were, they joined a small but haunting list of Australian cases where violence struck not in dark alleys, but inside ordinary homes and familiar places. Decades earlier, in 1965, Sydney was shaken by the Wanda Beach murders. Two teenage girls, Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock, were killed in broad daylight near a crowded beach. Despite massive public attention and multiple suspects over the years, the case remains officially unsolved. Like the Lin murders, it left behind fear, speculation, and a sense that answers had slipped through the cracks. Then there was the Lin Family Massacre in 1993. 7 members of the same family were killed in their rural home, including 4 children. The offender was eventually identified, but the scale of violence stunned the nation. It challenged the belief that family homes were safe from extreme harm. Another case that lingered for decades was the Margaret Tapp and Shiana Tapp murders in 1984. A mother and her young daughter were killed in their Sydney apartment. For years, the case went cold, marked by false confessions and investigative errors. A conviction wouldn't come until nearly 35 years later, reminding Australians how long justice can take and how uncertain it can be. When crimes like these happen, they leave behind more than victims. More than a decade after the 18th of July 2009, the Lin family murders still leave a heavy feeling behind. A quiet home, a trusted presence, 5 lives erased in a single night. Even with a conviction, the case continues to unsettle those who revisit it, not because of what happened, but because of how close and controlled it was. Do you believe the truth of this case was fully uncovered? Or are there parts of the story that still don't sit right with you? Stories like this remind us how quickly normal life can fracture without warning, and how some questions never truly fade with time. If you want more deep, dark true crime stories like this one, comment your thoughts below, like the video, and subscribe to the channel for more.